Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the Fargo-Moorhead-West Fargo Chamber of Commerce, Shannon Full.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Economic Outlook. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Although we wish we could be in person, and hopefully soon enough we will, we've got a great program lined up for you. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you a few important initiatives that we're working on here at the Chamber. So as always, we stay committed to the advocacy efforts on many levels, one being that at our state legislatures. So as the Minnesota session kicked off last week, the Chamber staff and community and business leaders attended the Minnesota Sessions Priorities event to connect with businesses with legislators and represent our business community's interests in St. Paul. Our policy team has been hard at work staying engaged with local legislators as sessions begin in both Minnesota and the interim committees meet here in North Dakota. Two of our top priorities on both sides of the river remain permanent flood protection and workforce. We are confident that the FM diversion project will allow for a vibrant community and strengthened economic stability. Our focus on workforce spans a variety of advocacy efforts and programs. One way that we are addressing the issue is through our joint venture with the Economic Development Corporation through Fueling Our Future. This program is tackling region-wide issues with large-scale solutions. Workforce fits into this picture through advocating for career workforce academies, engaging and retaining local college graduates through Campus FM, and providing more opportunities for business growth with a business accelerator. There are many exciting things that are coming out of Fueling Our Future involvement, and we look forward to continued momentum and success around community solutions. It is the Chamber's belief that all of our cities and communities working together as a metro will allow us to grow even stronger and continue the strength of our economy. So as with all of our events, today would not have happened if it were not for the tremendous support of several member businesses. The Chamber is proud to represent so many incredible businesses and employees who are working together to improve our entire region. Some of these businesses include the community builders, the Chamber's most exclusive level of membership. These organizations help the Chamber achieve its mission of enhancing the business climate in our region by going above and beyond their annual dues investment. We're honored to call these 54 businesses our community builders. We recognize the importance of their investment in our Chamber and in the community as a whole. In addition, the Chamber couldn't host such events like this without support of our sponsors. We extend a heartfelt thank you to the following Chamber member firms for sponsoring today's event. First, our presenting sponsor, who has presented for many, many years and continues to support us, is Cass County Electric Cooperative. Our executive sponsors are Eide Bailly, First Western Bank and Trust, Minnesota State University Moorhead, North Dakota State College of Science, Otter Tail Corporation, Sanford Health, Starion Bank, and Wells Fargo Bank. And event production sponsor, Super Studio. We also have 16 generous corporate sponsors. We are so tremendously thankful for the support of this important event. And once again, we would not be able to bring this high quality program to you without sponsors like this. One last thing before we get started, just a reminder to share the valuable information you hear today on Twitter by using the hashtag FMWFEcon throughout the entire event. And as you're listening along, we highly encourage you to submit your questions for the presenters through the question box to the right of the live stream. We will get to as many of these questions as we can after we hear from both presenters. So let's get started. I'm honored to welcome Marshall Albright, President and CEO with Cass County Electric, our presenting sponsor and MC for today's event. Thanks, Marshall.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 Economic Outlook. I am Marshall Albright, President and CEO of Cass County Electric Cooperative and proud sponsor of the 2021 Economic Outlook. In 2021, the economy will continue to be impacted by the pandemic, and if all goes well with vaccinations, hopefully life can return to something more normal by summer. Before I turn the program over to our special guests, I will provide an update on the power supply situation in the central part of the country. This week, the south central part of the United States was hit by a snow and ice storm and record low temperatures. The hardest hit was Texas. Dallas reached a new record low temperature of -2 degrees Tuesday, February 16th. Based on what I have read from the news reports, major power outages in Texas occurred because of the effects of the winter storm, cold temperatures, ice buildup on wind turbine blades, and lack of natural gas supply for home heating and power production. From an outsider's perspective, it appears they did not have adequate winterization added to the water cooling systems of their natural gas plants, and really poor overall planning for the what-if scenario. A few of their coal and nuclear plants were also impacted by the cold weather. Because of the conditions and freezing temperatures and record demand, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, was forced to implement rolling blackouts to avoid a complete blackout, which would have been catastrophic. Virtually all forms of power generation in Texas suffered from outages during the cold snap. 75% of their 600 units were affected, with early reports showing natural gas plants sustaining the most failures. Early Monday morning, ERCOT issued a news release saying generation assets across all fuel types had gone offline, amid reports of wind turbines covered in ice and natural gas wellheads freezing up. Southwest Power Pool, the regional transmission authority from Texas to North Dakota, also experienced high load levels because of the cold snap. On Tuesday, February 16th, SPP declared an energy emergency alert level 3. System-wide generating capacity dropped below their power demand due to extremely low temperatures and inadequate natural gas supplies. SPP initiated rolling blackouts on their entire system, including utilities in North Dakota and Minnesota. SPP impacted Cass County Electric because Western Area Power Administration is a member of SPP. Cass County Electric was affected at one substation south of Valley City that WAPA feeds. WAPA supplies energy through Missouri River Energy Services, including Moorhead and Valley City, who had some rolling blackouts on February 16th. Cass County Electric Cooperative purchased power from Minn-Kota Power Cooperative. Minn-Kota participates in MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that oversees the electricity superhighway or the bulk transmission grid from North Dakota to Texas. On February 16th, MISO initiated a MaxGen event that allows MISO to take control of the grid and generation resources to ensure grid stability and control loads or trigger rolling blackouts as needed. Yesterday, 80% of the power supplying the central U.S. in the MISO and SPP area were coming from coal and natural gas. We had a little oops in our program here. Okay, up a little bit. Okay, right there. They're coming from coal and natural gas, and about 6% from hydro, and about 4% of the power was coming from wind. Some key points to remember, I think that this situation has really not taught us, but I think we can learn from, is that reliable fuel sources supply reliable power. And what I mean by that is when you have a coal plant, you have coal on site for power source. Hydro is basically the water on site. And in nuclear, there's obviously fuel on site for nuclear. Sources that supply less reliable power are impacted by the current weather conditions, including wind and solar. Pipeline supply constraints of natural gas in some instances can also lead to natural gas shortfalls in power production and home heating. This was the case in Texas, and during the polar vortex we had locally here in 2019. On Tuesday, Governor Burgum said, this situation is a wake-up call, one that should trigger a national discussion about the importance of policies that support the absolutely essential need for baseload generation, such as coal-fired power plants, as part of the all-above energy strategy. Burgum added, instead of heavily subsidizing non-dispatchable intermittent sources with tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks, we should be investing in more research and innovation, such as carbon capture and sequestration, that strengthens our baseload capacity to meet the needs of all Americans, all of the time, with clean, reliable energy. The situation that occurred this week is a matter of national security. Our country needs reliable power. Compare how our Navy functions to secure our country. They run on nuclear, diesel, and jet fuel, not an intermittent supply. To keep the economy flourishing, and why we're here today to learn more about the economy, we need reliable and affordable energy for all Americans. We are honored today to have two very special guests. Joining us first is Rob Engstrom. Rob is the founder of Wolf Street Partners, a firm that advises trade associations, corporations, and state local chambers of commerce. He is a regular speaker on the political and advocacy issues for a range of audiences. Rob also leads the American Bankers Association's political engagement operations, including the association's Political Action Committee, grassroots advocacy, and voter education initiatives. Thanks for being with us today. Rob?
Marshall, thank you so much. What an honor to be with y'all. I certainly wish that it could be in person, and hopefully we can do that sometime very, very soon. But I appreciate the leadership of the Cass County Electric Cooperative. Thank you also for describing in detail the current circumstance that some of our fellow citizens are experiencing in Texas. I happen to go to school in Texas, have a bunch of family there, so I've heard a number of deeply troubling personal stories. But thanks for what you do to help lead part of that recovery, but also to unpack and put in plain terms what some of our fellow citizens are experiencing. And I want to appreciate Ron. Also looking forward to your remarks. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for letting me share the stage with you and ladies and gentlemen as well. I want to first appreciate very much my friend Shannon Full. I've had the honor to work with Shannon for over 15 years. She serves on the Chamber of Commerce Committee of 100. This is the group of leaders representing diverse geography, diverse economies, and she's someone that is a leader amongst leaders who really helps advise certainly outcomes in Minnesota, outcomes in North Dakota, as she described, but also someone that the U.S. Chamber takes great counsel from and the national business community benefits from. I'm proud to call her friend, but also proud to call her a deep colleague and deep relationship there that exists personally. And I'm grateful for the chance to be with you. So I want to make my best effort to unpack the 2020 elections and what actually did occur, what also didn't occur, challenge perhaps some conventional wisdom, some expectations that didn't ultimately align with outcomes. And then also provide a little bit of a lens in terms of what we can expect legislatively in terms of the Congress, but also we're in the cycle for redistricting. I know not in North Dakota, but it will impact the political debate and discussion that we have leading into the primary season, just because the redistricting timetable has moved from traditionally the late spring now into the early fall, essentially cutting the election cycle in half. So I just have a few remarks and certainly want to respect the time with Ron. And then we both look forward, Shannon and Marshall, to take questions both in the chat as directed, but also as appropriate in the ensuing discussion there. So look, our country has gone through what I refer to as a protracted period of disruption. I spend a lot of time, as Ron does, speaking to different business organizations, bankers associations. I'm deep relationship also with Rick Clayburgh at the North Dakota Bankers Association, who I consider a very close friend, also serves in the leadership of the American Bankers Association. And, the common theme, if I were to string together, a couple of speeches I do every single week to large audiences of over 1,000 people, small groups of 5 to 10 people, is people in the business community need certainty. And we have been in what I refer to as a protracted period of disruption in our politics that certainly goes beyond the last 4 years, certainly beyond the most recent and current administrations. I spent 5 weeks in 6 counties during the Florida recount, representing at that time the Republican National Committee. Protracted period of disruption during that time. I spent 2.5 weeks helping to co-manage the recount in Hennepin County in Minnesota during the 2008 election with Mr. Franken and former Senator Coleman as well. But we've remained in this protracted period of disruption. In the old world, if you went back to 1982 as an example, National Journal, a nonpartisan news outlet in Washington who looks at the Congress on behalf of business issues broadly defined, looks at the Congress and says, where are they? And as it relates to the issues that we care about in the business community, representing that and understanding clearly that the definition of being pro-business means different things within the state of North Dakota. It means different things in different parts of America, but there are some common threads that bind us together. So the analysis, to distill it quickly for the sake of setting the table here, is that in 1982, 90% of the members of the House of Representatives and also the Senate were within 10 percentage points of a governing middle, meaning that compromise was possible, meaning that Democrats from my home state of Georgia, where I went to school in Texas, were often rated as more conservative on business issues than perhaps some Republicans from the Northeast or the West Coast, as an example. That so-called mass in the middle has grown to be essentially a barbell or a Q-tip, where we literally have, at the last analysis, one member of the Senate, Senator Susan Collins from the state of Maine, Republican senator, deep blue state, who's within 10 percentage points of the middle, and only 13 members of the House of Representatives out of 435. So that means the concept of election day, which was something that I grew up with, has essentially turned into election year, where primaries are now more competitive than they were in the past. If you look at just pure frequency distribution and the issue set that gets debated on a lot of issues that we all care a lot about, and I'm sure Ron's going to talk about, I'll just give a hat tip to a couple of those here in a moment. So candidate recruitment begins, certainly for the Senate races, sometimes 2 years in advance. And the House, as I mentioned before, in states impacted by redistricting, is going to be a truncated process to within a year. But meaning that the first primaries for the House and Senate, the first Tuesday in March, all the way until some late states in September, that's where a lot of these races get decided. There really are only about 35 to 40 races anymore that are competitive in the House of Representatives on election day. So that means if you're a Republican in a bright red state, Democrat in the inverse in a deep blue state, you don't ever have to face a consequence come November. You care about that primary electorate. And obviously the primary electorate is a much smaller universe of voters who tend to be more ideological in their beliefs and their views. Many are single issue voters. That's even more pronounced in states that have caucuses like Iowa, as an example, Virginia, as well as an example. And then you have runoffs, like in my home state of Georgia, where we had quite literally the balance of the U.S. Senate, decided on January 5th of an odd numbered year, which is somewhat of an anomaly. It's the latest state in that regard, Louisiana, following a similar pattern, typically in the December timeframe, and then with small year elections. So the point is, we've had this protracted period of disruption from essentially 2000. You could go back before that if you wanted to. Wave elections for the Democrats in 08, in 06 and 08, Republicans for during 2010, of course, and then a series of asymmetrical elections and a significant outgrowth in the primaries, which have forced groups in the business community to become a lot more aggressive and active in primary elections. When I served for 19 years at the U.S. Chamber, and Shannon and I spent a lot of time working on this in states across the country to get it right, it being imperative that the business community, in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way, asserts clarity and asserts their voice in primary elections, because that's where the vast majority of those elections for federal office are decided. The same is also true in a number of states across the country as it relates to state legislative races. Of course, the state lines are also going to be redrawn as a part of this process, and the Electoral College will also be impacted, as it is every 10 years, as the population continues to move from north and east to south and west, and that essentially every decade moves a fairly good-sized state in the aggregate, from places like Ohio, New York, and Illinois down to places like Georgia and Florida and Texas and Arizona. So the question there is, as we migrate as a country before COVID, but also certainly during COVID, do our fellow citizens take their voting patterns with them, or do they assimilate to the states in which they move? And that's a question for economists. That's for That's for folks that follow demographic trends. And I think that disruption is also true in the polling industry. It's certainly true in the media as well. So, as a political analyst, as a political strategist, the thing that I know and the thing that I've been blessed to be able to do with friends like Shannon is to understand clearly the local impacts of federal policy. Shannon mentioned the impact of the talent pipeline and what that means in North Dakota, what that ultimately means for the energy sector as well. Also, infrastructure funding. What that means in different parts of North Dakota is different than what it means in different parts of North Carolina. But those are the top two issues that are number one and number two in chambers across America. And I would survey the 1,600 dues-paying members. Thank you, Shannon, for your assistance in that regard over the years. But we would survey 1,600 state and local chambers on a quarterly basis. And for almost 20 years, and I would suspect way before that, those are the top two things that small businesses, medium-sized firms, and large companies care most about, which is how do I retain talent, how do I train talent, and how do I ensure that the so-called tabletop of our economy, the roads, bridges, port, broadband, energy sector as well, how do I make sure the hospitality industry, the retail chains as well, how do I ensure that those businesses get the talent that they need, but the tabletop of the economy remains strong? Marshall talked about it in terms of planning for the worst case scenario. And it appears quite clearly from what I've read in news reports and people I've spoken with, that planning wasn't in place. That's for experts to decide, not a political strategist to decide, but it's a good reminder that chambers do two things. They advocate and they convene. We're doing both of those things on this call here today, but it means that we get a variety of different opinions to impact what local officials and also federal officials hear and what they see. And I meet with 150 candidates each cycle for almost over 20 years now for U.S. Senate, also for the House of Representatives and governor's offices. And the thing that I think has changed dramatically in the course really since the pandemic has begun, but especially since the disruption related to the virus, but also what occurred tragically with Mr. Floyd in June, also what occurred on January 6th, is that voters in the surveys that I look at and the focus groups that I study in all corners of this country is that Americans want straight talk, they want certainty, and they want competence and people that are focused on governing. Because the things that we've seen across the economy in the regulatory space and also in the legislative arena, the current disaster and circumstances in Texas are just an example of that, require that. So the conversations, I think, are getting more serious. I think they should be. The approval ratings of the Congress, as you know, are less than 20% typically speaking. So we're spending a lot of time working with chambers of commerce, working with state and local banking associations, trying to find women and men who understand how the economy works and have expertise in issues that really drive economic growth. Because, we always say, Shannon and I and others, we always say, Chamber of Commerce members and executives are required to be chief optimism officers to instill confidence in the economy, because we know that consumption drives the economy, investment drives the economy, and we need leaders on this phone call, and we need people that you can help persuade to be confident validators on behalf of the issues that we care as Chamber of Commerce members and friends, we care deeply about. So I'm bullish in terms of what the future looks like. I'm not also naive in terms of the challenges we face. I have not yet mentioned entitlements, which are obviously a huge driver of what the future looks like in terms of the economy. But our politics remains disrupted. Our politics remains bitterly divided. The majority, as you know, in the Senate, the same way it was after 2000, is 50-50, with the vice president breaking the tie on those issues, which will empower folks like Mr. Manchin, a close friend, Democratic senator from the great state of West Virginia, who will have appropriate and outsized influence on issues that matter related to energy policy, relating to healthcare, Medicare for all, and those issues. And also important sway on the regulatory space on those issues, certainly with financial markets being an important part of that, as well as labor policy there as well. So a narrow, bitterly divided Senate, as close as it possibly could get, And also the Republicans, exceeded expectations on the House side. It was the smart political pundits projected somewhere between a 5 to 12 seat gain for the Democrats, and now there's only a 5-seat majority net with all the races now being finally decided in a short 629 days before the midterm election, which is already underway in terms of candidate recruitment and certainly the meetings that we're having to try to convince people who come from our family, who come from the free enterprise system, who can represent these issues with clarity, with purpose, and with experience in the halls of Congress. So I think we're going to see a need for compromise. We'll certainly have issues that we disagree with this administration on. I would say that trade policy in particular, immigration reform, infrastructure, and the talent pipeline are issues where there's been bipartisan agreement in both parties to really help move the needle. I don't think you'll look for a bunch of comprehensive bills at this point on those and other issues, but I do think we can have some incremental reform in that regard. So in the Senate, Republicans underperformed from what expectations were, overperformed. Democrats underperformed on the House side. And so we're left with, yes, one party control in the House, certainly in the Senate, as well as with this administration. But there are moderate and thoughtful Democrats in both the House and Senate who do and have, in fact, been constructive on a number of issues that I've discussed here this afternoon that I believe that we can rely on, that we have deep relationships with. And so that's something that we will focus on quickly to respect the time and hand it over to Ron. And then we're happy to certainly take questions on 2022. The map on the Senate side is essentially the same. It's a static map. Republicans certainly on defense. Again, there really aren't many pickup opportunities for them, perhaps 3 in Nevada, Arizona, and also in New Hampshire. But those are 3 difficult states that have been trending away from the Republican Party over the course of the last 20 years or so, 15 years or so. So focusing on the Senate map is important. Republicans have had retirements are in a defensive posture in places like Pennsylvania, as well as Alabama and also North Carolina, open seats in those states. And then I would also suspect difficult challenges in places like Florida with our great friend Marco Rubio in essentially a nation state. Senate races have turned into essentially mini presidential races. In Georgia, if you put both of the runoffs together, it was almost $1 billion. And that's the money that they can count. So it's north of 800 million. And that's just the reported dollars. And so these are now literally mini presidential races with a tremendous stakes. But Republicans, no doubt, based on math, also retirement in Ohio with Mr. Portman, also a close friend. Republicans are on defense just based on math. On the House side, Republicans did gain state legislative majorities in states that matter. And so they'll be in control with the pen to help draw the lines in some of those important northeastern states in particular. New Hampshire just being one example of that, Pennsylvania as well. And so Republicans, if history is any measure, which in this remaining in a protracted period of disruption, history is a guide, but not necessarily determinative. Republicans should be, just based on math, in a good posture to potentially regain the majority in the House of Representatives, therefore having, again, divided government. The presidential race, Mr. Biden certainly has not declared his intentions, but published reports indicate he's unlikely to seek a second term, which means that the race for 2024 is already underway. Quietly, members on the Republican side are gathering staffs. Watch closely where former cabinet members from the Trump administration and other Republican governors and Senate members choose to travel in states like Iowa, in states like New Hampshire, early states like Nevada, as well as South Carolina, Florida being really critical as well. So that is something that typically doesn't begin until 2 years before the November election, the presidential year. It's already underway, and in some measure, it's not necessarily so subtle. Final point, Shannon and Marshall, as well as Ron, is that the vast majority of states have gubernatorial elections, obviously state sessions, which drive local issues instead of presidential, national, and international issues. Certainly, given the disruption, there would be all of the international and federal issues that will be relevant. But really right now, in terms of economic issues from my seat and being on the phone with chambers and bankers associations every day, there is an acute focus as Marshall mentioned, also Shannon mentioned at the top, on the local impacts of state policy as well as federal policy. And back to the beginning, really focusing on certainties. My dad would say to my sister and I growing up, you can deal with good news, you can deal with bad news. You can't plan for or anticipate what uncertainty is. And so that's what I think chambers do an exceptional job of, is really having a voice from every corner of the economy to make sure that we do in fact plan for circumstances that are unforeseen. And so the political environment will remain unsettled for the foreseeable future. I look forward to the questions. I will certainly be happy to yield back to my colleague and friend Ron, Marshall, also to you, and we'll both be pleased to take questions at the end of the discussion.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate your insight on our political landscape. And when you talk about, certainty is a big issue for a lot of us, including our industry. We've been running on uncertain policy lately, and we need some certainty in our industry so we can make good decisions moving forward. Next, we are very honored to have with us Ron Wirtz. Ron Wirtz is the Regional Outreach Director for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and he's with us today. Ron's primary responsibility involves tracking current business conditions across the 6-state 9th Federal Reserve District, which includes Northwest Wisconsin, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Minnesota, and the Dakotas and Montana. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you very much, Marshall. So many thank yous to start with. Marshall, I thought your intro and that description of the energy issue to start off was really useful to me. Rob, you're starting with that idea of volatility is something I'm going to build on. You gave one of the best encapsulations of the political environment that I've heard. That is going to be must listening to my peers back at the bank. So I appreciate all your comments. I thought they were really right on. And let me also give a shout out to Shannon and the Fargo Moorhead West Fargo Chamber. I really appreciate just the opportunity to network with the group here. In part, one of the things that we're doing more of is we're trying to get out of Minneapolis and get into the Dakotas and Montana and talk to more businesses. I want to thank the audience today. One of the things that we did recently is I've been doing a lot of survey work. The Fargo Chamber partnered in the latest one that I did. We got a really good response from North Dakota businesses. I'm going to talk about some of that today. So for everyone here today, I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you. Before I get into my talk, I need to give you my disclaimer. So the views here presented are mine, and they're not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. I like to say this is kind of my bozo slide. So if I happen to say something inaccurate or foolish, you blame the clown and not the circus, okay? So real quickly, for those that might not be familiar with the Federal Reserve System, there are 12 district banks located across the country. We're more than a 100-year-old institution, Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. The role of the district banks is, at least from where I sit and the job that I do is in monetary policies, we're charged with tracking the state economies in my region, as Marshall had described, roughly Upper Peninsula, Michigan, all the way over to Montana, obviously including Minnesota and North Dakota. And how we do that has also been changing. And I'm going to describe to you how we're trying to think about that economy. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the pandemic economy. So where I want to focus you is, in the third quarter, we saw a really strong bounce back after that terrible dip in the second quarter. What we've seen since then is a softer fourth quarter. In general, what we're seeing is that a lot of small firms and certain industry sectors are bearing a much heavier cost from this pandemic, not only nationwide, but also in Minnesota and North Dakota, though there's some uniqueness with both what's happening in North Dakota and Minnesota. What's unique to North Dakota is that in terms of the pandemic, the energy downturn has really had a more notable effect than in any other of the district states. Unique to Minnesota is that it has had more operating restrictions that have affected more businesses in that way. A lot of labor trends right now seem to be a bit murky, and I'll get into more detail on that. The good news is that there seems to be some optimism for the first quarter and moving forward, and the same with the outlook. I'm going to give you an awful lot of detail. One thing that I've always envied with fellows like Rob that can talk extemporaneously, I'm a picture guy. So I'm going to show you a lot of data via charts. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these. I'm going to be sharing this PowerPoint. Try not to focus too hard on any single, don't get your hook too far in your mouth for any chart because I'm going to be moving on, but I'm going to share this PowerPoint and you can take a deeper look later. Okay, so where are we going to start is kind of at the top of the data chain, and that's gross domestic product, basically our output. So what I want you to focus on are the dips. So you have the big dip in the second quarter, and then the bounce up in Q3. So the only data we have for more recent is at the U.S. level, and Q4 suggests that we've seen still growth, but a much softer fourth quarter, and we're still well below pre-pandemic levels. Part of the problem in terms of trying to figure out where we are in the pandemic from a state level or a regional level or a local level is data is very lagged. So the best data we have for that kind of gross measure for North Dakota and Minnesota is only the third quarter. That is a lifetime ago in terms of really understanding where we are right now. Some of the other things real quickly in terms of how we think about who's being affected in terms of change in GDP from Q3 2019 to Q3 2020. Basically, what we've seen is that while there are variations by state to the national average in terms of particular sectors, there are some that are just fairly universally bad or less affected. So you have accommodation, bar, restaurant, arts and entertainment, transportation and warehouse has also seen a hit. And then mining and energy extraction and agriculture actually is the only one that has seen kind of a net positive. That's in part because things were particularly bad leading up to that period. So that's improved a little bit by context. One of the areas that we pay a lot of attention to is construction. We think it's really a bellwether for the overall economy. As Rob had mentioned, investment really matters, and you're not going to build a house, you're not going to build an office tower unless you have some confidence in your ability to pay for that going forward. So I track a number of different measures for construction. This is Dodge Data Analytics, and it runs through December, and this is a rolling 12-month average. Otherwise, you get a lot of volatility in the data from a seasonal standpoint. So this hopefully shows you a little bit more of the trend. The North Dakota chart on the left, the Minnesota chart on the right, both basically say the same thing. We are in a decline right now, and a fairly significant one. The good news right now, at least in Minnesota, I would say the picture's a little bit better, is that we're still at levels that were roughly equal to a couple of years ago. Again, the trend now, or the point here is where exactly are we going to start seeing the bottom and start seeing that trend reverse and rise again. The one other thing I'll note is that I do a number of different surveys. I'll talk a little bit about that. I actually have a construction survey in the field this week, and there are a number of North Dakota and Minnesota construction trade associations involved in getting that out to members. If you happen to have seen it in your inbox, I'd love to get your input on how your firm is doing right now. It's the only construction-based survey in the Federal Reserve System right now. We get a ton of feedback, a ton of intelligence from that survey. So if you see it, I would love your insights on that. In terms of employment, this is kind of one of the bedrocks of how we think about how our economy is doing. What I would say is that Minnesota, or the good thing for North Dakota to start there, is that it didn't see quite the same dip as Minnesota did, but it's had a much flatter rebound. Minnesota has fallen deeper. It rebounded a little bit more sharply, not crazy, but it rebounded a little bit better. But we've seen a little bit of a drop off since then. So I would say overall, while I think there are some positives in the economy, this is one that I think is probably the most worrying, in that the trajectory for getting back to pre-pandemic levels is really, really soft. The other way to think about how different things are being affected in the economy is I like to look at goods versus services. Goods in this case is agriculture, manufacturing, construction, energy, anything that produces a good, basically. And what we've seen, what tends to happen is that recessions tend to hit the goods sectors harder than service. That has actually been reversed in this particular recession, with the exception of energy states, and in this case, North Dakota. So as you can see here, the blue bar is the goods, and North Dakota has seen a significantly harder hit to its goods sectors, in part because the construction sector is also really affected by the downturn in energy, because so much of their work goes into that infrastructure piece. In other states and across the nation, generally speaking, we've seen that the services area, the bars, restaurants, recreation, those things that have been affected by crowds, that's been more affected in this recession. In terms of taking a little bit closer look, you can actually see that that energy downturn even more. If you look here, is that it's really pronounced in terms of the goods downturn in the places outside the largest cities of North Dakota. So you see Bismarck also is seeing that, probably from that arc of the Bakken that has so much influence on Bismarck. But in terms of Fargo, the ratio is much closer in terms of where the job loss has been. Grand Forks actually has been seeing some increase. I'm not sure exactly what that is from. I would love a little side note maybe after this on what's happening in Grand Forks. I wasn't familiar with. I don't know if there's a manufacturer there that's doing particularly well during this period. But as you can see, generally speaking, this goods recession really is centered in that Bakken area, I think. In terms of what we're looking at going forward, the good news for the employment outlook is that job postings have largely recovered, not only through the nation, but in North Dakota, they're actually above last year's level. Minnesota has actually seen a really nice increase just in the last month and is getting pretty close to par. The problem is job postings don't equal hirings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, the central message is that there are a lot of because there's so much volatility from the pandemic, it's really introduced a lot of additional friction in terms of employers trying to find workers and workers trying to find something that will fit what they need for their needs. Unemployment, we talk an awful lot, and there's a very good story here, and then I would say there's an uncertain story here. So I have two charts here. The U3 employment is the employment rate that you hear about, that you read about in the newspaper. The U6 employment figure is something that's a little bit more broad and takes in those people. I have the definition at the bottom of this slide. Generally speaking, it's those that want a job but haven't looked for a while, and those that are working part-time but would prefer full-time. And the story for the U3 measure, we've seen unemployment rates come down very significantly, and that's the good news. The bad news is that we also know much of the decline has come from people exiting the workforce altogether. Remember, if you're unemployed, you have to be looking for work. If you had a job and you've left and you don't have that job anymore and you've stopped looking, you're not counted. And we know that's happening. So the U6 rate is capturing some of that. The reason I include this is I think it gives a little bit better idea of total slack in the labor market. The reason the U.S. Chart looks a little bit different is that's a monthly measure, so you get a lot more granularity, and you see where the shock is in the early part of the pandemic. The Minnesota and North Dakota ones they're actually a quarterly measure, so they're automatically smoothed a little bit more, and they're all relatively close. But you can see here that the U6 rate is roughly double to 2.5 times more than what the U3 rate is. This is an issue that was a pre-pandemic one, because we had been seeing labor force participation drop. It's really become a problem now because despite the fact that we don't know exactly where it is, there's a lot of noise, especially at the state level. That's why you see a lot of squiggles right there. I think when it finally flattens out, we're going to see that labor force participation has declined by a percentage point or two. And that's a dramatic number. If you happen to take a look, Minnesota was basically at 70% for almost the entire last decade. It's been going down. If you go back even farther back to about 2000, it's been steadily declining for a lot of reasons, part of which is demographics, part of which is not. But what we've seen with the pandemic is that it's declined even farther. So despite the fact that there are a lot of jobs out there, a lot of people are saying, work right now. I've decided not to work right now. And there are a lot of reasons. I also pay a lot of attention to unemployment insurance. And there are two measures here. The initial claims is the blue bar, the blue line bar. And basically, that's just a measure of who is seeking, who applies for unemployment insurance. The good news is that after a rise that I didn't think was actually possible, we've seen it come down very steadily in North Dakota. And I'm only going to talk about North Dakota in this case. Minnesota tracks this from a trend standpoint. It just happens to be proportionately more elevated for all the things I'll talk about. The initial claims has come down really nicely in North Dakota. What I would say though is if you look at the end of the blue line and the start of the blue line, current applications still are roughly 2 to 2.5 times what you would normally see at this time. So there's still a lot of dislocation in the employment market right now. In terms of continuing claim, the big orange blob, same story. It's come down a lot, but it has been recently increasing. That's not necessarily surprising because there are seasonality factors, but it's been going up more than we would have expected, and it's higher than levels were pre-pandemic. The other thing this chart doesn't show is that the federal stimulus packages have created new types of unemployment benefits, and those are not reflected. That's more difficult data to get, but I can get it for Minnesota. And in Minnesota, the chart literally doubles in size for the number of people receiving benefits. So I know the number that are receiving benefits also in North Dakota is significantly higher than this. So again, it's just another example that there is a lot of slack in the labor market that we don't necessarily have a great handle on. All of the data that I've been showing you help give I think, a good picture of where we are at a certain point in time. There's never enough good real-time information, and there's also a lot that we don't know just from a regional standpoint. One of the things that we've tried to do to try to fill that timing gap and locality gap is that we've really dramatically increased our outreach to the business community, to those of you that are listening. Since March, since the start of the pandemic, we've done 15 different surveys, kind of in different sectors, in different places. We've actually gotten responses from more than 12,000 businesses across the district. Interesting with that is not only have they given us their answers to kind of multiple choice quantitative questions, we've gotten over 30,000 open comments, and many comments are sentence length. And so we've gotten an immense amount of information from a kind of a granular standpoint of how businesses are reacting in this environment. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the most recent survey we did. General Business Survey was conducted in mid-January, and we did it through 50 different partners, including two partners, the Margot-Forehead West Fargo Chamber and the Greater North Dakota Chamber, help us get that survey out to businesses in North Dakota and in Greater Minnesota. So we had about 120 responses from North Dakota firms, a little bit more in Greater Minnesota, and more than 1,000 across that 6-state region. So we think the results are a pretty good snapshot, but because of how we sampled and how we got the survey out to people to respond, it's not technically scientifically valid, but we do think it's a very good snapshot of what's happening. So a couple of takeaways. So generally speaking, North Dakota and Minnesota have generally reported what I would call slightly to more negative revenue trends. And where revenue trends are, that tends to influence how you respond to most other things like workforce, wages, and things of that nature. More importantly than geography is that size and sector are really, really big factors in how this pandemic is affecting businesses. So the first question that we ask is a question about Q4 revenues, and we ask them to compare to 3 different time periods. We ask them to compare to the same quarter last year in 2019, the previous quarter 3 in 2020, and then we ask them to tell us their expectations for the first quarter of 2021 compared to last year. The way to look at most of the charts that'll come in the next 6 or 7 charts, or slides, excuse me, is red means bad, deep red means worse, green means good, deeper green means better. And basically what you can take from here is there's an awful lot of red on the slide, basically. So in terms of compared to last year, what we're seeing is that most firms are seeing a negative revenue trend compared to last year. Most are also seeing a net negative revenue trend compared to last quarter. and their expectations for the first quarter are also negative. Now, that doesn't necessarily square with what we were hearing in the overall economy. I wouldn't even tell you that it seems this negative, despite the fact that we're in a pandemic. Part of the reason, these next two slides will hopefully help explain, is that we're seeing significantly different experiences by sector. Now, what I would tell you is even in the best sector, that very bottom chart or the very bottom bar, finance, insurance, and real estate, they are by far giving us the most positive response of any sector that we are surveying. When it comes to those that are seeing a more negative outcome, this has been very consistent since we've started these surveys. Accommodation, food, drink, entertainment, retail, they have typically been on the top of a very unfortunate chart, that they are seeing very difficult circumstances because of this virus and its impact on consumer-facing, crowd-dependent kinds of enterprise. More importantly for me, sorry, went the wrong direction. Excuse me. I'm going to do this very quickly. We do ask states to identify, or firms to identify what state they are in. What I would tell you here is that South Dakota consistently ranks at the top among these states in how, in terms of seeing less bad outcomes. That's a bad way to say it, but I also don't want to spin it too well. Most of their net response is still negative, okay? But they are better than the other states that you see here. Part of it is response based. So there is composition factors that we need to take in consideration. More respondents from Minnesota and the UP and Michigan were responding in those sectors that have been more hard hit, the accommodation, entertainment, those sectors. So I'm seeing a little bit higher share in those sectors in Minnesota and the UP. I'm seeing a smaller share of that in South Dakota, and more firms like banks respond in South Dakota. I think the representation here is accurate. What I would say is if you waited for all those factors from a geography standpoint, you'd see these results compress. So there's probably a little bit less difference among states than this chart possibly suggests. What I would tell you is size, I think, matters more than almost anything here. This has been the most consistent finding I've seen in virtually all of our surveys, is that size matters. The larger you are, the better your revenue results in general. Particularly as you get smaller, you're seeing more and more negative and more deeply negative outcomes. So how this kind of explains how we should think about the overall economy, I don't want to say that there's good news in this chart, but in terms of the overall economy, large firms have a larger share of the overall output. They have a larger share, a disproportionate share of employment. So the fact that large firms are doing better actually is better for the overall economy. So this survey is a really good representation for how firms are doing, because we have more small firms respond to us. There are more small firms in the economy. So we have a really good snapshot of how different kinds of firms are affected. What we don't have as good of measure in, because we aren't weighting this, is what's the overall economic impact. I hope that makes sense. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer period. In terms of some of the other outcomes that we looked at, I wanted to give you a little bit of breakdown for North Dakota. Again, be careful of small sample sizes, only 120, but you can here also see, generally speaking, you're seeing more negative outcomes with regards to size and small size, I should say, both for last year's a revenue comparison to last year and a revenue comparison to the last quarter. So workforce is down. There's kind of a good story here. Workforce, even since October, we're seeing a net negative trend in terms of workforce. We're seeing more firms still cutting. That kind of explains to me why some of the unemployment insurance applications are still high. The good news is that they are suggesting that the coming 3 months, we're going to see that shift. And job postings suggest that. I think that maybe is what's embedded here, is that they're hoping to hire. What my hope is that we actually get to the hiring part. Again, from a labor standpoint, it's not clear that that a lot of people are ready to go back to work that maybe weren't. I hope that changes. We also know that firms are facing an awful lot of challenges aside from just slack demand. So we ask them, we give them a range of choices. And here right now, what North Dakota respondent said is the biggest issue right now is the simple COVID-related quarantine of workers. That can have a tremendous impact, whether you are a restaurant or a manufacturer who needs people on the line, or you're maybe a transportation firm that has to get that manufactured product to maybe to the restaurant. We know that supply chains have been dramatically impacted during this COVID environment, and that business operations, just in general, it's a huge challenge, to say nothing about whether or not customers are coming to you. Even if they are, there are lots of difficulties. So it's just a really tough time to be running a business. To those businesses out there watching, you have my greatest respect. I know running a business is tough anytime. Running it during a pandemic, it's seemingly impossible, it seems to me. In terms of outlook, there is some optimism, and that's kind of where I'm gonna end up stopping at. Is that the outlook right now for the first half? Again, South Dakota is leading the charge. We are seeing a net positive really in every state in terms of what they see, what their level of optimism versus pessimism is going into the first half. I don't think there's any question it has to do with the fact that we're in a lower infection environment, and we have a vaccine that's getting out there. North Dakota has been doing a great job getting its vaccine out there. Some states are close. South Dakota is also doing a good job. I think Minnesota's catching up. I think right now it can't come fast enough. And I think what we have to hope is that the production side can really keep up, and that our distribution then can really continue to execute. Are there any trade-offs? Yes. And what I haven't talked about in terms of the pandemic effects is it's the other side of the economic openness. I actually gave a talk to the South Dakota Chamber yesterday, and this is something that I also brought into the discussion, is that there is this balance between, are we going to protect businesses or are we going to protect people? I'm not going to tell you that there's a right or wrong. I think states have decided which route they want to take. I think there have been some clear differences in performance as a result of that. But I think we have to acknowledge that different approaches do create different outcomes, not only on the economy side, but also on the health side. So some real quick takeaways. So again, Q4 really, I think, saw some slowdown. I'm really interested to see the state level data to see if we're reacting any differently. I don't expect that, but by the same token, some of the federal stimulus numbers that I'm seeing, or the numbers that I think are getting juiced a little bit by fiscal stimulus, I think may suggest there's some different pattern here. North Dakota and Minnesota, in general, overall, everyone's been affected. I think there's been some differences, in part because Minnesota's had more restrictions. North Dakota has an energy sector, and I think both of them have had different effects. Again, the slowdown, mostly I would attribute to the fact that we had a virus surge during that. There have been pretty strong indicators that as the virus surges, consumer confidence changes, consumer activity changes, and we think that's probably a very good reason, or one of the reasons why activity probably pulled back a little bit. We know that small firms in certain industries are really getting hit hardest. I think from a fiscal, from a stimulus mindset, I think there is some interest in trying to address some of those issues. Unemployment rates are dropping. That's the great news. I do think there are other metrics. Shannon mentioned in her opening, workforce is a major issue. It will be, I think, one of the absolute key issues going forward. I think there's more slack in the labor market than our unemployment, than our U3 measures suggest. The good news is that, at least from an employer standpoint, I hear a lot of positivity, especially related to work to jobs. What I hope is that workers respond and we really do get back to work. I think there's a really optimistic outlook due to the vaccine. What I would say, though, kind of my last point, is that I have a feeling we think that we're almost on the other side of this. I would really hesitate to say that yet. There have been so many changes in the course of this. We're not even in a month yet. And there have been so many changes, so much volatility, to Rob's point, that I think we have to be careful of taking that exhale and feeling like we're on the other side. What we have to, I think, more think about is how do we build the base higher so when we get to the other side, we are really ready for launch. And I do think my boss, Neil Kashkari, has been, I think, really adamant about this point of saying controlling the virus matters. I think the Dakota economies saw that when we saw a really big surge. I think there was some attention then to get that under control. Minnesota saw some of the same things and is also controlling it in a different way. But I think if we fail to control the virus, it's really hard for me to figure out a path to really strong growth between now and when we actually do have full vaccination. So I would say we still really have to keep our eye on the ball with regards to that. I'm hopeful. I do think many of the main ingredients for strong growth are there, and I'm really hopeful for a strong 2021 for everybody that's listening today. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone. Happy to take questions with Rob.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you for sharing your economic statistics and insight on the regional economy. I think to keep the program rolling along, we do have several questions that did come in for you guys, so I'll start and go through those. So the first one is for Rob. Rob, DC and Puerto Rico statehood are conversations that will likely arise. How do you believe this would change the political landscape of the United States if they become states?
Thank you, Marshall, for the question. It would be a dramatic change in my judgment. Both of those states and territories in the Puerto Rico example, this has been a longstanding issue for a number of decades, a similar issue, though not responsive to the question, but I basket them together as the idea of expanding, or as some people would say, packing the Supreme Court of the U.S. I don't think either of those are likely, given the narrow divided nature of our Congress at this point in time. Though the question was, what would it mean a dramatic, would there be a dramatic difference? It would represent essentially, almost certainly 4 more seats in the Senate for the Democratic Party, which would be significant. I think it's politically untenable at this particular point in time. I would say the same thing about the Green New Deal, as well as Medicare for All. I think if Democrats had a larger majority, then it might be more possible. But I just don't see Democrats from energy producing states, such as Mr. Manchin, that I referenced before, and also others. I don't believe it's politically palatable in the majority in both houses.
Okay, thank you. Any comments on that, Ron, at all, or should I move to the next question?
No, I really don't. I wouldn't mind if they do get added. I just want to make sure we get the district office in Puerto Rico. That's all.
Okay.
Right. I'm for that.
Yeah. Well, the next question we have has to do with the economy. And, what do you see as possible long-term economic implications of the various COVID-19 federal aid packages? And what that means to the economy from we've infused trillions of dollars into the economy, and what impact will that have on interest rates, on inflation, and just the economy in general? That's probably both of you guys can probably take care of that. Ron, do you want to take care of it?
Sure, I'll start on that one.
Okay.
So I think people are wise to be paying attention to how much stimulus is going into the economy. But my boss has been pretty adamant. Neil Kashkari's been real adamant about this point that if we don't do anything, the decline we're going to see is going to be so tough to grow out of that it's really kind of the better of two poor choices. We would prefer not to have to stimulate the economy like this, but without it, it's very clear that many, many, many businesses are going to go. They're going to go out of business. We know households are also in very difficult financial positions. So we could choose to not spend that, but if you lower your base on where you're going to grow, and it kind of goes to the last point I made, is if we're going to allow the economy to sink deeper and deeper, the path back to full growth is going to be longer. And if we can get to full growth quicker, we'll be in a position where our economy can support the debt that we've taken on. Again, I would call it the lesser of two evils, but I think in our opinion, the federal stimulus has been really important, is really important going forward. In terms of inflation, it's clear anytime you flush a lot of money into the economy, that's going to be a concern. What I would tell viewers, though, is that we've been waiting for inflation for better than 12 years. And I think a little bit of inflation, actually, we would see as a positive sign that real demand is picking up. Again, we're not sure in all cases why we haven't seen more inflation. The fact is, it hasn't been there. So it's one of those things that we obviously keep a very close eye on, but we think the need to support businesses and households right now through a situation that is a health-induced crisis, we think is the better choice.
Rob, any comments on that?
I wouldn't add a thing to what
Okay.
Ron said. Sounds
I thought he did a great job too.
yeah.
The next one I have is relating to workforce. So relating to the necessity of recruiting and retaining talent, what innovative and effective practices would you encourage us to think about for employee compensation and benefits? Either one?
Ron, you want to start? I'll be happy to follow up.
Well, I'm very hesitant to tell employers, how they should manage their workforces. So, in terms of innovation, what we are trying to do is pay more attention to why labor force participation has been declining. Before the pandemic, all we heard about was workforce. Even now in the pandemic, we're hearing a lot about workforce and this inability, this matching difficulty. And without a doubt, there are some obstacles for workers to overcome, but we also have to start taking a look, I think, more at what are the jobs that are out there and why aren't they getting filled with any regularity. I think we have to start looking at job quality. My boss has been pretty famous for saying, if you haven't raised wages enough or you haven't raised wages much, that's really on businesses to figure out what's going to attract enough potential labor. Obviously, that's a very difficult issue. I'm never going to tell a business that they're not paying enough. It's tough to run a business, and being able to raise wages is a very difficult thing, especially if you're not confident that you can pass that input through to your retail market. I understand those difficulties, but we don't think that simply having jobs out there is good enough. I think we do really have to start thinking about what are the ways, especially in a pandemic, there are so many additional frictions. Parents have to stay home for maybe virtual learning. There are health concerns. You don't want to bring a virus back home. Again, it's so tough to run a business and even tougher now to find labor given all of these different circumstances. But I do think in terms of workforce, pulling more people into the labor force, it's going to be an all hands on deck with firms, with workers, with workforce development organizations that are working with people that aren't in the labor force right now. It has to be all of the above kind of strategy, in my opinion.
Rob, any further comments?
Yeah, it's right on. It's Ron, thank you. I think it's about developing, attracting, and also retaining talent. And that means different things in different parts of North Dakota, means different things in states across the country. I spend a lot of time speaking to universities, but also vocational schools. One of my best friends from college is the vice chairman of the Texas State Technical College. So also valuing vocational technical expertise as well. And certainly before the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic, I think that there's certainly migration, as we discussed earlier, in terms of people moving to places that they want to live. But also, to Ron's point, is the right kind of jobs and the right kind of pay, and making sure that's not being prescribed, but it's being encouraged and it's being valued. And I remember speaking with some manufacturers during a press conference down in Florida a couple of years ago, and I had some household name manufacturers who said, look, I've got 200 jobs in this particular southern state alone that pay $120,000 a year on average. And Rob, I can't find the people. How do I find the people? How do I either retain the people, keep the people, either attract them, also from other places, or how do I develop and incent that talent? And so it's why, as I mentioned earlier during my brief remarks, it's why talent acquisition, the talent pipeline, education reform is one of the top, along with infrastructure, buckets and priorities for chambers across the country. And that means very, very different things in different places. But I think this disruption that we're experiencing also does provide opportunity in the talent acquisition, retention, development space, in my opinion.
Yeah, Marshall, I'll add one more point. So I do talk to a lot of businesses, a lot of workforce development folks as well. And, I had this conversation with a staffing firm, and this person mentioned that, previously it wasn't unusual for a particular client of his to see 100% turnover in the course of a year in terms of the people that this firm was supplying. I think there's no, and I think we've actually, before the start of the pandemic, I do think we were starting to get a handle on this idea that turnover might be more costly than anything to a firm. And I think more firms are maybe starting to really grasp that. I think the pandemic has maybe put some of that on hold just because, it's such a crisis from a workforce standpoint. But I think too, this particular staffing firm contact told me, a lot of firms are starting to move to this, 24/7 schedule, with 12-hour shifts over the weekend. And they're surprised when they can't get anybody. And that's because workers don't want to work those kinds of schedules. It might be the most efficient way to run a plant from a production standpoint. It might not be the most efficient way to run a plant from a labor standpoint. From a labor's viewpoint is what I should say. And I think those are some of the things that, businesses are constantly reevaluating. I don't doubt that for a second. I don't think I'm telling anybody any particular news, but I think when labor is short, we're going to have to make more concessions. If labor is important, we're going to have to make more concessions to figure out how we find labor. I think that the other side of that coin, businesses are also going to look at how do we get rid of labor costs? How are we going to automate that thing that we used to have a person doing? That's how economies work.
Well, I think you guys did a great job answering that question. The next one I have is related again to COVID. So what is likely to become the number one legislative priority? Immigration, infrastructure? What are your thoughts on that? And maybe Rob?
Rob, that's your alley for sure.
Well, I'll start and just say I see a great connectivity between immigration reform, talent acquisition, infrastructure funding, and trade. I think there's certainly concentric circles around those issues, as I also mentioned earlier, and Ron did too. There's a bipartisan agreement on certain elements of those issues. And so I think that those would be four things that could be put forth to gain some momentum and build the muscle memory in terms of governing, with narrow majorities in the Senate and the House. And a personal comment is my wife's from El Salvador originally, came up to the U.S. for college, also for grad school. So I personally have seen, sitting in the interviews at USCIS and other places, I've seen what that process looks like in my personal life, and been, with the U.S. Chamber, also with Shannon and others, and chambers across the country, a fierce advocate for immigration reform, specifically Dreamers, H-1Bs, H-2Bs, a number of different, elements around that complicated political situation. But there are a majority, in my strong opinion, there are a majority of members in the House and Senate on a bipartisan basis to get something done on that particular issue. I think if we can get something done and gain momentum on immigration reform, I also think we can pivot to infrastructure. To Ron's point earlier, it's also a financial issue in terms of the dollars that go out the door and what that means ultimately back to entitlements as we think sort of 25 and 30 years down the road. But I think those four issues, the basket of issues, are very complicated political issues, but there's also some low-hanging fruit there. And so I'm sort of bullish on some elements of immigration reform. Finally, I'd say I think it's also a balance between what the president chooses to do in terms of his executive orders, which he's fully within his constitutional rights to do so on a number of different issues. But I also think that it depends upon where the substance lies between the authority of Congress and the authority of the administration. The biggest question to me is what gets accomplished in the regulatory space and then ultimately in the courts, perhaps, versus what gets done on a bipartisan basis. We know with the Trump tax cuts, we also know with Obamacare that things that are done in the Congress on a strictly partisan basis are not durable. The other party will spend the rest of their careers trying to unwind it. And so I'm not naive at all. But I do think that I know that members of Congress traveling to, I've traveled to all 50 states, spent a lot of time in North Dakota. I know that there is bipartisan agreement on those specific issues. It matters what the content is of the bill, the substance, the timing, and the cost. And then also finally, proximity to the primary season, which will impact a number of different folks in both political parties.
Appreciate that. Ron, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would narrow the focus just a little bit. I think what Rob discusses there, I would agree with. The two things that I guess I'm kind of hopeful for that we see some action on, I would say public health and broadband. What's happened from that energy event that's happened down south, I think is a little bit analogous to our public health system right now. We got faced with a pandemic. We weren't prepared for it from a public health standpoint. We didn't understand it. I don't think we. What I'm hopeful for is that we maybe inject a little bit more. I'm not even sure what it is. Maybe a little bit more organization, planning, and those things, and resources necessary that when the threat hits, and we know these threats are going to be coming again, that we are prepared. We know how to handle, and that we have the public on board with what that approach is. So that's one of my hopes from a policy standpoint. The other one is broadband. I don't think this has been on the docket, I think, in the mindsets of a lot of people. I think the pandemic has really accelerated and emphasized the need for broadband, especially in states like North Dakota, more rural, in the rural parts of Minnesota. I don't think there's any question it's the infrastructure for the decades coming ahead. More so than I think other things in terms of what is our economy going to depend on? What are people going to depend on to get their education, to get training, to get lots of things that I think we kind of took for granted, or at least some of us that maybe haven't take for granted, and really has been exposed as a disparity during the pandemic.
Appreciate that. Thank you for those answers. The next question, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and move to the world stage. And the question I have here is, how will the Biden administration, how will their policies differ probably from the Trump administration in China? What economic impacts is that likely to have on our country?
I will only go first and say that's out of my wheelhouse and pay grade, so I'm going to pass on that one.
Rob?
Well, whenever you ask the political guy about policy, and especially international policy, it's a dangerous thing. So I will caveat this with, here's some initial reflections, and I'll keep it short to make sure I stay in my lane also. But it's tariffs, I think, are the first issue. The variance with the current president's approach, his relationships with world leaders. He does have rapport. Whether you agree or disagree on the issues, he is a seasoned diplomat and thoughtful person who does have the respect of members in both parties and also around the world. And so that's something that, he doesn't need to take a number of years to build those relationships and introduce himself. He has relationships. So we can then have a discussion about what that means from a policy perspective, but that's something that's immediately different, is the relationship there. There's no lead up in terms of getting to know and understand what Beijing is about. The tariff piece, I think you've seen some articles over the weekend about the Biden administration, asserting a somewhat direct posture with China, particularly on tariffs. We have to see what that looks like in terms of the math and the economic impacts, but it's a huge market, obviously. And there's significant, finally, intellectual property and privacy issues that are consistent and are especially pronounced, that I think that the administration, I would suspect, that's sort of towards the top of their list.
Okay, thank you. I do have one more question here for Ron. Do you see any validity in the argument that asset prices are absorbing every uptick of inflation?
I don't know if it's absorbing. Money has to go somewhere, and I think the stock market. I think one area that I'm glad I didn't get into was in stock picking, because the little bit I've done and what I expected the stock market to do during the pandemic has not been reflected in where it is now. I'm not going to tell you I understand why asset prices are as high. I think one explanation is, again, that money has to go somewhere eventually. And I do think prices are maybe embedded in there a little bit. But I think that what we are seeing, though, if you take a look at inflation trends in general, they are independent of what happens in the stock market. You're not seeing, any one-to-one relationship with inflation and what's happening in the stock market as it goes up and down. So to some extent, I think the federal stimuluses have been helpful for the stock market as it relates to inflation. I'm probably less inclined to say there's a strong direct relationship there.
So I'll kind of ask a follow-up question to that. So, based on how the markets have risen over the past year, which I think has been kind of unexpected for most of us, when's that bubble going to burst? And is it going to burst in 2021?
At the Federal Reserve, we don't ever like to use the word burst.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought you were going to say.
Again, we're not paying attention specifically to the stock market. What happens in the market, we're paying attention to without doubt, but that is not how we're controlling monetary policy. That's not what we're controlling monetary policy for. It is more the fundamentals of the economy. Are people working? Again, our dual mandate, for those that aren't familiar, we are in charge of two things. When we address monetary policy, when we change interest rates or do other things like in the Great Recession, when we created quantitative easing and other programs, we have to have two things in mind: stable prices, okay, because businesses, right back to Rob's original point, volatility. When prices are rising up and down really in a very fast fashion, that doesn't help businesses plan. They need a stable price environment to invest in the future. So that's mandate number one. The second one is maximum employment. Now, how we think about what maximum employment is has changed a lot. We used to think maximum employment was 5% unemployment. Clearly, that's out the door. We're still really trying to get a handle on that. And in this pandemic, it is a moving target at best. We know that there's lots of slack in the full economy. We're seeing our unemployment rates really come down to levels really fairly quickly. But we know that the labor market is more dynamic than just what that U3 measure is showing us. So those are the things when we think about monetary policy. And we're not thinking about the stock market. It's those two things. Now, they have influence on stock market, but again, that's a secondary effect.
Thank you for that answer. The next question I have is for Rob. Rob, given that investment is an integral part of recovery and growth, do you see the current political climate hindering that process via future tax law or other legislation the next few years?
It's a great question, and I'll maybe start and then hand it certainly over to Ron as well on this topic. It goes back to, I think, volatility, also certainty, is what can businesses expect? I do believe and know, and we all followed the presidential race. The current president ran directly on repealing elements of the Trump tax cuts is one example, and it goes back to the question of how much of that can be achieved, through the regulatory process, and then how much of it, without getting in the weeds of Washington swamp talk, how much of it can be achieved through reconciliation, which requires 50 votes plus the vice president breaking the tie. I don't think very clearly, I don't think you're going to see the Republicans in the Senate repealing the signature achievement that almost all of them, if not all of them, ran on for their elections in the last 4 years in particular, and those folks that are in cycle next time, encapsulating the entire Republican caucus. So I think if it's done on reconciliation, which is an arcane or not an arcane, but a procedural move to move legislation with just the 50 vote plus one. But I don't think you see a support for a bipartisan repeal of those tax cuts. And so I think you have to delineate between what elements will be done administratively, on a regulatory basis versus legislatively. And then next, the question, in my opinion, is what repeal, if any, will be focused on the business community, corporate tax rates versus individual tax rates as well. So that's the political frame for a substantive debate that I think that we'll see in the short term.
Any comments, Ron?
Again, I would say this is a little bit out of my area of specialty. I think Rob's points are right on. The only thing I would say is that With regards to tax regimes, you know, they do change over time. Republican, Democrat, they clearly have some effect in the long term. I think they tend to have maybe less effect than we maybe assume in macro. That's not to say they don't influence individual businesses, but from a macro standpoint, it's not like after the tax cut, we didn't see anything notable in the data from a dramatic, an up or down dramatic change. So from our standpoint, that's a fiscal matter, a legislative matter. From our standpoint, from the Federal Reserve, it's really not something that we have, much of a race car in.
I appreciate that answer, guys. Okay, I have one last question for you before we end today, and it's a little bit more, it's a political question. So is there a belief that Ivanka Trump will attempt to a primary against Marco Rubio? And if so, will she win?
It's a great question. I think what I've learned the last 4 years is that anybody, quite literally, can run for office and win. And that's directed at a number of different races that I've been following in certainly both political parties. But, Ivanka Trump, that's one rumor that I've heard. And also Laura Trump is rumored last week to be a candidate for the Senate in the open seat in North Carolina as well. North Carolina lowered their threshold for a runoff from 40% down to 30%. So the number that she or anybody else that would challenge is a lower number than it otherwise would be. But just one anecdote that I think demonstrates in maybe a precise terms, it's anecdotal, not substantive, but it's reflective of what's occurring across the country. Just in one example, there was two special elections in North Carolina for the House in 2019. You had 16 Republicans file for one race, and you had 10 Republicans file for the others. You have 26 candidates. You have the current state senator, the former state senator, the ag commissioner, the treasurer, like literally all the animals in the Republican zoo in North Carolina 9 and North Carolina 2 that decided to file to run for office. That creates a math issue in terms of, especially with the runoff in that case, it dramatically disrupts what the electorate looks like. And if you think about President Trump's successful run in 2016, there were 17 candidates that were in that race. I showed up in Jeb Bush's campaign, one of the first 4 people in the office before electricity was on, and took a leave of absence from the U.S. Chamber. And conventional wisdom, January 4th, as we opened up the office, was very different than what the outcome would be. And so I think voters have very strong opinions, especially in primaries. And so I've learned in my time to not rule anything in or rule anything out. I would be surprised. I've been surprised certainly before, but in my old life at the RNC in the late 90s, I did travel to North Dakota and other states to focus on candidate recruitment for local offices for 4 years. And I would say the discipline around recruitment, what it means for local political parties and state parties has been a dramatic top 3 disruption, in my opinion, in the last, let's say, 20, 25 years or so. So I've learned to never say never.
Well, I appreciate that answer. Politics has been in the news probably more than ever in those last 4 years, and life is different in politics today, and who knows what the future will hold, as well as the economy. So with that said, you guys did a wonderful job today answering questions and presenting information to our membership. Thank you both for sharing this important information today. And on behalf of the Chamber, thank you all for attending the 2021 Economic Outlook. Please watch your inbox for a survey to share your feedback on today's event. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.